My name is Robert Bland. I am a professor of history and Africana Studies at the University of Tennessee. I have been a full-time professor for about 5 years now. I began this career path really in undergraduate. I was passionate about history. Pursued a history major. Taught high school social studies before I ended up going to pursue my PhD class. So I was not a person who went right away to get a PhD. I taught students like you in Jackson, Mississippi. Taught ninth grade social studies, 11th grade and 12th grade social studies, but eventually went back to get my PhD at the University of Maryland. PhD takes a long time. I was in grad school for about 7 years. And once I finished my grad school experience, I had a PhD. I went on an academic job market. And my first job was at the University of Pittsburgh. Then I worked at the University of St. John's University in Queens, New York. And in 2019, I moved to Knoxville, Tennessee, where I'm still reside and teach today.
That is a broad spectrum of the United States. To go from Pittsburgh and Mississippi to Tennessee, it seems like you've been all over the place. Are there any areas that you really enjoyed more, or has it just been kind of different experiences, different places?
I like living in Washington, D.C. a lot. I was there during the Obama years, so kind of the historical nature of the Obama presidency, plus D.C. is a place where a lot of people move to. It's very busy. It's very engaging. New York City is very interesting. I like living in New York City a lot. I like Jackson, Mississippi a lot. Jackson's got a very rich history. There's great people. There's a civil rights movement history there. You can meet a lot of the veterans and the folks who were actually participated in the movement. Pittsburgh was pretty cool. It's a kind of old Rust Belt city. In a lot of ways, it's very similar to Knoxville, right? I think they often call Pittsburgh the Paris of Appalachia, and I think you can kind of see some of those cultural similarities between Knoxville and Pittsburgh.
Absolutely. One of my kiddos had the question, and it was from Asia. She said, was there anyone who discouraged you while working towards this field? If so, did they influence you to become better?
No, it's there's certainly people who will question your path. I think grad school, the hard part is that there's so much pressure and kind of almost hazing, right? It kind of, when you're a grad student, you are at the bottom of the rung in the university world. And so everyone's telling you you're not good enough, but that's not necessarily to discourage you from doing it or leaving. It's just, right, they don't see you as a real scholar yet, right? There's a lot of, you write something, this isn't good enough, you present, and it's not necessarily mean-spirited, but you can, it hurts, right? Because you want to be a full-fledged, serious intellectual. One of my favorite musicians, Miles Davis, has a quote: "It takes a long time to sound like yourself." And I think when you pursue an academic career, it takes a long time to find your voice, a long time to figure out what your ideas are. And people will tell you, this doesn't make sense, this isn't clear, this is not, essentially not good enough, right? Not that you as a person aren't good enough, but to get your work to a level, right? You learn, right? You have to stick with it. You keep on practicing. Anyone who's picked up a music instrument or tried to learn how to play a sport, the first couple of times you do it, even the first year or two you do it, you're not really as good as you will be. But you kind of put in your 10,000 hours and you eventually get there.
Absolutely. And I think that's a lesson that any human can learn, across the board. It doesn't have to be kids. I mean, there will always be people who discourage you. This is kind of a personal question. I know that to get your PhD, you have to be published. What was your first publication that you were able to put out?
Right. So I worked with some scholars at Tennessee State University, and we produced a group paper on the legacy of historically Black colleges and universities. And I published that while I was in grad school. To get out of grad school, the big thing you have to publish is your dissertation, right? And your dissertation is essentially a big idea that adds a new piece of knowledge. So you have scholars and writers who've been working for almost thousands of years producing ideas, and you have to come in and say, I have an idea that all these people in 1,000 years have never discovered before, and I'm going to say something new about history that no one else has done, and I'm going to use primary source documents and do this research. And so my dissertation was on the legacy of Reconstruction in South Carolina, and I had to publish it. It was about 300 pages. Took me about 3 years to write. And you have to publish that and present that in front of your dissertation committee, all people with PhDs who've written hundreds of books, dozens of books on their own collectively. And so you have to prove to them that you know something that they don't know.
That's very intimidating. Was there anything that helped push you through doing that? Because 3 years, that's a long time to be writing one document.
Yeah, no, if friends help, family helps. The kind of idea that you can write something that makes a difference, right? I always say, like, I want to be the person who writes something that I would have wanted to read at 17, 18 years old, the thing I would have liked to seen. So remembering the dream, remembering why you entered grad school in the first place, what you're passionate about. I think that's what helps get you through.
Absolutely. As a child, what did you think you wanted to become and why?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, what I really wanted to be was a basketball player. I was really good in high school. I actually played with LeBron James, and we were on the same All-Star team at one point. Then I blew my ACL out twice, so I tore the ligaments in my knee, rehabbed it, came back and tore all the ligaments in my knee again. I was always good at history. I was a strong student. I went to a school that had sports, and I played a couple of years of Division III sports, but I also took my academic career seriously. I thought about being a lawyer after my basketball career was over. I was a high school teacher for a little bit. I thought about potentially going into Wall Street or doing something where there was a lot of money to be made. And ultimately, I kind of listened to my passion in my heart. As I know I enjoy writing. I enjoy thinking about big historical ideas. I'm going to pursue a PhD in history and become a history professor.
That is an outstanding response. With you tying in playing basketball with LeBron James, that is crazy to have that kind of start to your life and have that goal. Did you ever have any adversities that you felt like you couldn't overcome them? Was that like a turning point for your life when you tore your ACL?
Yeah, I'm a person who thinks that anything is possible if you put your mind to it. But there's also you have to figure out, like, what are the ultimate costs, right? I mean, I could have potentially tried to keep pursuing basketball, but potentially there's a point where if you're pursuing it too long and with too much tunnel vision, right, you close out other opportunities, right? So I still enjoy sports. I watch sports. I play recreationally, but right, the kind of to be a certain careers, right, you need to dedicate more energy to, right? So there are sliding doors moments where I could really pursue this dream, or I could look at my other talents and say maybe it's time to put one dream away for now and try something else, try something new, right? That's tough, right? That's kind of negotiating with your ego, kind of saying this thing that I've always done is the thing I'll always be, and you have to give yourself a chance to grow and try new things and be a different version of yourself.
And I think that can be overwhelming no matter what path you're on in life. Those big turning points are always really difficult to take that leap. Who do you think was your biggest influence? Who helped inspire you?
Yeah, I would definitely say my parents inspired me. They both worked very hard to get where they were to give a better life for me and my sisters. They pushed my sisters and I to be academically successful. Um, they believed in us when maybe we didn't see the what was possible. I think the biggest thing, right, is there are always books in the house, right? So there's a kind of culture around reading, about being intellectually curious, about asking questions, and I think that was incredibly helpful for kind of the person that I am now in terms of professionally, but also I'm just kind of a curious person interested in the world. My grandparents were incredibly helpful. None of them went to college, but they were all people who grew up in the Jim Crow South, grew up when segregation was alive and well, and they raised their kids, my parents, with kind of love, with tenacity, with courage. One of my grandparents drove in the civil rights movement, drove in the Tallahassee bus boycott. So kind of thinking about history and how history kind of repeats itself and kind of teaches and learns from it. during World War II, my grandfathers went off to World War II and served the country, came back to a country where they didn't have all their rights. And I think about that story a lot. I think about my grandmothers who were incredibly intelligent, did well in school, and didn't really have the opportunities to kind of go on and pursue other kind of options, right? To kind of had working class jobs, good jobs where they pursued them with dignity, and kind of thinking about their stories, right? So I think I certainly draw inspiration from those family experiences and those stories.
My husband's father was, well, his grandfather was a Tuskegee Airman, and his family has just passed down the stories of that legacy, and my son has a poster up in his room that has like the emblem that was hand stitched, and having that kind of inspirational figure in your history, it really gives you someone to look up to, having that story passed down to say, look at all these adversities that this person has faced, but they were still able to accomplish these overarching goals. So I love that you were able to bring about all of those people who you had in your history as well. That is absolutely outstanding. Do you feel that you have any specific advice for any kiddos who might be interested in pursuing a career path in history and studying history?
Yeah, no, I would say always read, right? And not just history books, although you might want to start reading the kind of stories of history that are exciting to you. There's certainly, in a world where we have Netflix and Hulu and Amazon, there are so many good documentaries to watch that I kind of start figuring out, like, what about history is interesting? Is it specific stories? Is it specific eras or specific people? Um, I think going to college is an important part of that story, although you don't have to go to college to engage in public history or to make a difference with kind of historical stories. But um, preparing yourself, whether that's taking AP history in high school, whether that's going to a kind of advanced work at other types of honors classes. When you go to college, right? I think it'd be really helpful if you're passionate about it. Not only take history classes, but take advantage of office hours, right? Talk to your professors, ask them about their own journeys. In college, it's especially at a place like University of Tennessee. These places can be so big that you can kind of get lost in the crowd. And I think if you can kind of show yourself to be an individual person who's curious and interested, people remember that, and they'll want to help you. They'll want to write a letter of recommendation for you. They'll want to tell friends at other grad schools about you. And I think that's the kind of next step where you go from an undergrad degree where you get a college degree and then go into a graduate degree. That's a big step, and right, kind of having people who are looking out for you, people who will advocate for you, people will tell you what it's like, and kind of so you can make a decision on your own if that's what you want to do. I think that's incredibly helpful and important.
And that's a huge goal with me actually doing these interviews, is to give my students kind of that opportunity to kind of taste those different fields and see how an experienced professional gets there. So I really like how you articulated those little steps they can take. Do you have any advice on them kind of deciding those paths? Like, what makes you want to jump up to that higher level in studying history?
Right. I think it's at some point, if you find yourself wanting more, right? If you find yourself in your regular history class and if you're reading more than the teacher assigned you, you might be a history nerd. Not that you need to get that checked by a doctor, but it's like, no, maybe when you get an opportunity to pursue a little bit more, you should do that. If you find yourself, again, watching a documentary, if you find yourself asking questions about your grandparents about kind of what was it like when they grew up, and those are signs that you maybe, when you get a chance to take an advanced class, you should do so. Certainly, if you have a book fair at your school, or if you kind of have an opportunity to pick up a book, and even if it's a young adult book or a kind of an age appropriate history book, right? Um, Read as much of those as possible, right? Ask the questions in class that you think are interesting. And there'll be opportunities, whether they're summer camps, whether they're opportunities in Knoxville, whether it's Kumbah Fest or it's the kind of August 8th festival. take advantage of those, right? There's a really rich history in Knoxville, Civil War history, civil rights history, kind of just the history of East Tennessee and kind of the specific place it played in Tennessee history. Exploring and being curious about the world around you, I think, are ways that can kind of get you on the path to being a historically engaged person.
And I went to one of those August 8th festivals a couple years back, and the amount of history and culture that I learned in that one sitting, it was just phenomenal. And I don't know if that was UT that put that on or who it was. I think it was at the Tennessee Theater, but it was outstanding, the amount of information that they had put together.
Well, this is a rich, rich place in history, right? And there's all different ways you can engage and become a historically minded person just here in Knoxville.
And with your specific niche with Africana Studies, what would that entail for any kiddos who are interested in following that path?
Right. So Africana Studies comes out of African American Studies, Black Studies, right? These are all programs that kind of emerged on college campuses in the late 1960s during the Black Power movement, as Black students actually took over buildings and said, we demand a curriculum that reflects a true understanding of America, right? Kind of doesn't whitewash history, doesn't whitewash the kind of things that this country tells about itself. So it's interdisciplinary. So there's certainly history classes fit in Africana Studies, but so do sociological classes, sociology classes, literature classes. So writing about Black life, Black authors, matters, often diasporic. So, right, these classes not only focus on the African American experience, but the Caribbean experience, the African experience, the experiences of people of African diaspora in places like Europe and Asia. There's also kind of courses that are specifically Africana related or African American studies related. So rather than saying someone's trained as a historian and we're going to put them in an Africana Studies department, someone's trained to read literature as a scholar of English, and they're going to be in the department. You say, what kind of things can we specifically learn by bringing all these things together and analyzing whether it's American life or Caribbean life or just kind of life in the world through the lens of people of the African diaspora.
With that being said, do you have any must reads that you've recently gone through that you would recommend for my students?
That's a really, really good question. There's a book by a scholar named Clint Smith called How the Word is Passed. And it's an exploration in the legacy of slavery in the United States. So he travels to different places. He goes to New Orleans. He goes to Monticello, where Thomas Jefferson built his home, and kind of tremendously kind of important place in American history, but also recently, right, kind of has to tell the story of Sally Hemings, right, the kind of enslaved woman who bore his children. And it kind of, Clint Smith's book is really a deep exploration in kind of all the ways that slavery is all over the landscape, but we don't always talk about it, especially in this moment where Confederate monuments are beginning to come down and be removed in the United States. There's a book by a scholar named Amani Perry called May We Forever Stand, and it's a history of the Black national anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. And it's a song that your students are probably deeply familiar with, but like kind of that has a history, right? It does, like, so if you're interested in like those little things, right? How do things we kind of experience every day, right? How do they come about? Where are they from? I think that's a history book that I recently read that I found was really interesting and rich.
My kiddos right now are actually doing a speech where they're refuting the speech to the Senate that was given by John C. Calhoun. So I think that first book that you recommended would definitely hit on a lot of those points, you know, because they actually had the recent tearing down of one of his monuments and how there were a whole group of Black government officials who had to walk by his monument every day to get into their office building. So I personally would love to read that book as well. I think that sort of like look back on reflection of history and the people who have been idolized, I think that is so important in understanding the culture of America right now. So
certainly again, it gets to kind of that idea that history is everywhere, and that if you're not paying attention, right? Someone's giving you their version of history, right? So again, always be curious, always be critical. And I think, right, you're walking through a world that's been shaped by not only kind of the actions of important famous people, but the actions of people who want to tell stories about how we remember the actions of people, right? And that's how we get statues, how we get street names, how we get the names of schools that we go to, how we get the name of all types of things on the landscape. And I think, right, John C. Calhoun's an important example of one of those individuals who's everywhere. And if you're not careful, you don't know why he's everywhere.
Absolutely. All right, for my last question, and thank you again for really digging into all of that documentation for us. My kids will have a lot to look into. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stated, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." Do you feel that in 2022 America that this dream has come to fruition, and why?
It's important to know that the world's changed a lot since when Martin Luther King was alive, right? That's not to say that there's not still discrimination, but I mean, the world that my grandparents grew up in is a different world than the world that I grew up in, right? The level of discrimination was much higher in a lot of ways. The kind of ways that people would discriminate you was more blatant, more obvious. Um, and with that said, right, as much as kind of the doors of opportunity have been open, there's still battles to fight with regards to police brutality, with regards to kind of closing the racial wealth gap, with education and kind of there's a number of studies that say our schools are more segregated now than they were immediately after the civil rights movement. So in some ways, right, the kind of the many of the laws that kind of enforce segregation have been rolled back, but in other ways, right, kind of our society is segregated. Our society does have a tremendous wealth gap. That's not to say that that can't change, that the students can't fight and make a difference. That doesn't mean that you don't have access to places like a University of Tennessee, or you can potentially go on and be a doctor, a lawyer, engineer, like a kind of high paying job. But there are also kind of ways that the people are still facing discrimination, right? There's still inadequate resources being given to schools down in East Knoxville. And I think being aware of that, right, kind of there's opportunity, but there's also opportunity to forget kind of that discrimination exists, and if people are failing, it's a personal responsibility. It's they've messed up, as opposed to, again, if you look at history, there's kind of deep structural things in the law, in society, that maybe people born on one side of town get some opportunities, while people born on another side of town get fewer opportunities.
I actually live in that area. And I'm not gonna lie, I have my kids move to a different school because the schools that are around my house aren't going to be the same as if they get bussed out to a magnet school, or if they got bussed out to a different area. And there are a lot of kids who don't get that opportunity, you know? So it is a little disparaging, I guess, but being able to see the differences and just trying to make whatever fill in the gaps you can, I guess.
Right. No, it's freedom is not a kind of linear path, right? A kind of freedom is not an easy journey, right? It kind of to change things means kind of confronting power. It means asking people to all of us to change, right? It's not something that kind of gets kind of solved with kind of a parade or a march. It's a long struggle, right? It kind of the king who's kind of making a speech in 1963 is a different king in 1968 when he's kind of confronting some of the deeper structural things that he's had to face, and kind of realizes that this marching is not enough.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for doing this interview. I really appreciate it.